The morning sun cast its warm light across the sleepy village, where the sea breeze carried the scent of salt and wildflowers through narrow cobblestone streets. Rashid sat on a wooden bench outside a modest clay house, gazing at the horizon as if searching for answers he knew would never come. His hands, once accustomed to signing royal decrees and grasping ceremonial swords, now bore the calluses of hard labor. This was his new life, far from the palaces of gold and the expectations that once consumed him. The village was a sanctuary, simple, unassuming, and brimming with life. Children chased chickens in the dusty alleys, while shopkeepers prepared for another day of trade. The faint sound of the market stirred in the distance, accompanied by the laughter of fishermen mending their nets. Rashid had chosen this place for its anonymity, where no one asked questions and no one cared about his past. But the past clung to him like a shadow. It haunted his dreams in fragments, the glint of sunlight on marble palace floors, the echo of courtly laughter, and the final, devastating image of his fiancée's face as the world crumbled around them. He had come here to forget, yet forgetting felt impossible. The village schoolhouse sat near the center of town, its walls painted with fading murals of flowers and birds. It was here that Rashid first noticed Layla. She stood outside the building, animatedly talking with a group of children. Her laughter was melodic, a stark contrast to his own silence. She had a natural way of drawing people to her, as if the weight of the world couldn't touch her. "Good morning," she greeted him one day as he passed by on his way to the market. Rashid froze, startled by the simple act of acknowledgement. Most villagers had grown accustomed to his solitary nature and left him alone, but Layla seemed determined to pierce through his quiet facade. "Morning," he replied, his voice rough from disuse. He nodded briefly and continued on his way, the moment lingering in his mind far longer than it should have. Rashid spent his days doing odd jobs around the village. He repaired roofs, helped fishermen haul their catches, and sometimes worked in the fields. Physical labor kept his mind occupied, though it couldn't fully drown out the whispers of his past. His neighbors knew him only as Khalid, a drifter who had arrived one day and offered his hands to anyone in need. His strength and reliability earned their respect, but they never pried into his life. It was Layla who began to unravel his carefully constructed isolation. She appeared at the market one morning while Rashid was loading sacks of grain onto a cart. "You work hard for a man who says so little," she remarked with a teasing smile. Rashid straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "Work is simple. It doesn't require much talking." Layla tilted her head, stunning him. "That's one way to look at it. But don't you ever feel like talking might make the load lighter?" He hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Before he could find the words, she added, "We could use someone like you at the school. The roof leaks when it rains. Would you take a look?" Her request surprised him. "I'm not much of a carpenter." "You seem like someone who learns quickly," she countered. And with that, she walked away, leaving him no room to refuse. The schoolhouse was small but vibrant, filled with laughter and the soft hum of chalk on slate. Rashid spent the next few days repairing the roof, often catching glimpses of Layla as she taught. She moved among the children with effortless grace, her enthusiasm contagious. Rashid found himself drawn to her, not just for her kindness, but for the way she seemed to carry light wherever she went. When the repairs were finished, Layla insisted on thanking him over tea. They sat in the courtyard of the school, shaded by a large fig tree. "You've done a fine job," she said, pouring tea into small clay cups. "It's a relief to know the children won't have to dodge raindrops during lessons." Rashid managed a small smile. "I'm glad I can help." Layla leaned forward, curiosity flickering in her dark eyes. "You're different from anyone I've met here. There's a story behind those eyes of yours. One you're not telling." Rashid stiffened, his smile fading. "Everyone has a story. Some are just better left untold." Layla didn't press further, sensing his discomfort, but her words lingered in the air. For the first time since arriving in the village, Rashid felt seen, not as the broken man he believed himself to be, but as someone who might still have something to offer the world. As the days turned into weeks, Rashid found himself more integrated into the rhythm of the village. He helped build a new fishing dock, assisted at the school when extra hands were needed, and even joined the occasional gathering at the village square. Yet, despite these small steps forward, the ache of his past remained. One evening, as he walked home under the glow of lanterns, Rashid paused to look at the stars. The same constellations that had once hung over his palace now shone over this humble village. It was a strange comfort, a reminder that some things remained constant, even when his world had been turned upside down. For the first time, he allowed himself to wonder if this village could be more than a refuge. Could it become a home? And could Layla, vibrant, kind Layla, be a part of that? The thought was fleeting, chased away by the familiar weight of guilt and duty. Still, it lingered, a fragile ember in the darkness. As Rashid drifted to sleep that night, the memories he had fought so hard to bury began to resurface. Images of the palace, the tragedy, and the love he had lost swirled in his dreams, pulling him back to a past he couldn't escape. The sound of Layla's laughter echoed faintly, a tether to the present he didn't yet understand how to hold on to. The dreams returned that night, vivid and relentless. Rashid found himself once again in the grand halls of the palace, surrounded by marble pillars and golden chandeliers. His fiancée, Noor, stood at the far end of the room, her laughter like a song. She beckoned him closer, her hands adorned with delicate henna designs. But as he reached for her, the scene shifted. The vibrant colors of the palace blurred into smoke and chaos. Screams echoed in his ears, and her outstretched hand dissolved into nothingness. Rashid woke with a start, his chest heaving. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of moonlight streaming through the window. He pressed his palms to his face, willing the images to fade. It had been over a year since Noor's death, yet the memories clung to him, refusing to let go. Outside, the village was still. The sounds of the sea filled the silence, a rhythmic reminder of the life he now lived, a life far removed from the one he had once known. Rashid rose and stepped onto the small porch, seeking solace in the cool night air. He gazed at the stars, but they offered no answers, only the cold comfort of their indifference. The next morning, Rashid returned to his routine. Physical labor was his escape, the steady rhythm of his hands distracting him from the turmoil in his mind. But even as he worked, the dreams lingered, their weight heavier than usual. Layla noticed the change. She saw it in the way he carried himself, his shoulders hunched, his gaze distant. She approached him as he repaired a section of the schoolyard fence, her presence as light as the breeze. "You look like you haven't slept," she said, handing him a cup of water. Rashid accepted it with a nod. "Just a restless night." Layla studied him for a moment, her brow furrowing. "Restless nights usually mean restless thoughts. You don't have to carry them alone, you know." He hesitated, the words on the tip of his tongue, but the weight of his secrets held him back. "I'm fine," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. Layla didn't push, but her expression told him she didn't believe him. "The festival's in 2 days," she said, changing the subject. "You should come. It's good for the soul to be around people, to celebrate." "I'm not much for celebrations." "Maybe not," she said with a teasing smile. "But even you deserve a little joy now and then." Her words stayed with him long after she left. Rashid wasn't sure if he deserved joy, not after everything he had lost. But a part of him, a small, stubborn part, wanted to believe that she might be right. That evening, Rashid found himself wandering the village, drawn by the laughter and music coming from the square. The preparations for the festival were well underway, with strings of colorful lanterns hanging between the buildings and tables, laden with fresh fruits and pastries. Children ran through the crowd, their faces painted with bright patterns. Rashid lingered at the edge of the square, unsure of whether to step into the light or retreat to the shadows. He was about to turn away when Layla spotted him. She waved, her face lighting up with a smile. "You made it," she called, weaving through the crowd to reach him. "I was just passing by," he said, though the lie felt hollow. "Well, since you're here, you might as well help," she said, handing him a basket of flowers. "We're decorating the stage." Rashid couldn't refuse, not with the way her eyes sparkled with determination. He followed her to the stage, where a group of villagers was stringing garlands of flowers and lanterns. Layla climbed onto the platform, gesturing for Rashid to join her. As they worked, Layla chatted about the festival's traditions, her voice full of enthusiasm. Rashid found himself listening, the warmth of her words chasing away the chill of his memories. For the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of something he couldn't quite name, a faint hope, perhaps, or the beginning of belonging. Later that night, as Rashid walked back to his small house, the memories of the festival mingled with the ghosts of his past. He thought of Noor, of the life they had planned together. Her laughter had once been his anchor, her presence a light in the storm of his royal responsibilities. Losing her had felt like losing a part of himself. But then there was Layla, kind, patient Layla, who saw through his silence and offered him a chance at connection. Rashid didn't know if he could accept it, if he could let himself feel again after so much loss. Yet the thought of her smile, her laugh, lingered in his mind, a faint echo of something he couldn't ignore. That night, as he lay in bed, the dreams came again. But this time, they were different. The palace was still there, its grandeur overwhelming. But Noor's face was replaced by another, a face framed by dark curls and a smile that held the promise of healing. Rashid woke with a start, his heart pounding. He sat up, running a hand through his hair, and for the first time, he allowed himself to wonder, could this village, this life, be the refuge he had been searching for? The next day, the preparations for the festival continued, filling the village with energy and anticipation. Rashid found himself drawn into the whirlwind of activity, Layla's laughter guiding him like a beacon. As the festival approached, the walls Rashid had built around himself began to crack, letting in the light he had so long kept out. The village square was alive with energy on the morning of the festival. Brightly colored banners fluttered in the breeze. The scent of roasted meat and spiced pastries wafted through the air, and the rhythmic beat of drums echoed in the background. Rashid stood at the edge of the bustling scene, watching as the villagers worked together to bring their celebration to life. He had never seen anything like it, joy so genuine, so unburdened. "Rashid." Layla's voice rang out above the noise, and he turned to see her weaving through the crowd toward him. She wore a vibrant dress of deep blue, its embroidered patterns catching the sunlight. A flower was tucked behind her ear, giving her an air of effortless beauty. "Are you here to help, or just to observe?" she asked, a teasing smile on her lips. "I haven't decided yet," he replied, his voice lighter than usual. The atmosphere seemed to have a way of loosening the tight grip he kept on himself. "Well, you don't have much of a choice," Layla said, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward a group of villagers assembling tables. Rashid stumbled after her, unable to protest. By midday, Rashid was fully immersed in the preparations. He carried tables, hung lanterns, and even helped a group of children arrange bouquets of wildflowers. Though the work was simple, it felt meaningful in a way he hadn't expected. The villagers treated him as one of their own, their laughter and camaraderie filling the void he had carried for so long. Layla was never far from his side, her presence both comforting and invigorating. She had a way of drawing people in, her laughter contagious and her enthusiasm boundless. Rashid found himself watching her more than he intended, drawn to the warmth she exuded. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the square in a golden glow, the festival officially began. Music filled the air, and villagers gathered to dance, their movements fluid and carefree. Rashid stood at the edge of the square, content to observe, when Layla appeared beside him. "You're not going to stand there all night, are you?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "I don't dance," Rashid replied, shaking his head. "Nonsense," she said, grabbing his hand once more. "Everyone can dance." Before he could protest, she pulled him into the center of the square. The music seemed to pulse through the ground, and the villagers clapped and cheered as Layla led him in a simple, playful step. Rashid felt a wave of self-consciousness. But Lila's laughter dissolved his hesitation. Her joy was infectious, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to let go. As the evening wore on, Rashid found himself enjoying the festival more than he had anticipated. He shared a meal with the villagers, their stories and laughter weaving a tapestry of connection that felt unfamiliar yet comforting. Layla sat beside him, her presence a constant source of light. "You seem different tonight," she said quietly as the festivities began to wind down. "Different how?" he asked, curious. "Lighter," she said, her eyes searching his face. "Like you're finally letting yourself breathe." Rashid didn't know how to respond. He wanted to tell her that she was the reason for the change, that her kindness and patience had begun to chip away at the walls he had built. But the words felt too heavy, too revealing. Instead, he simply nodded, offering her a small smile. Later that night, Rashid walked Layla home, the quiet streets of the village a stark contrast to the earlier revelry. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of flowers from the festival. They walked in companionable silence, the unspoken bond between them growing stronger with each step. When they reached her door, Layla turned to face him. "Thank you for coming tonight," she said. "I know it's not easy for you to be around so many people." "It wasn't as bad as I thought it would be," Rashid admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. Layla smiled, her eyes softening. "You belong here more than you realize, Rashid." The words struck a chord deep within him, and for the first time, he allowed himself to entertain the possibility that she might be right. As she disappeared inside, Rashid stood on the doorstep for a moment longer, the weight of her words settling over him like a warm blanket. That night, as Rashid lay in bed, he found himself thinking not of the palace or Noor, but of the village and Layla. Her laughter echoed in his mind, mingling with the images of the festival. For the first time in years, the darkness that usually consumed him seemed to recede, replaced by a faint glimmer of hope. But with that hope came fear of what might happen if the truth of his past were ever revealed. Rashid knew that the life he had built here was fragile, a delicate thread that could unravel at any moment. And yet, for the first time, he found himself wanting to fight for it. The peace Rashid felt after the festival was short-lived. The arrival of an unexpected visitor the next morning threatened to shatter the fragile balance he had found, forcing him to confront the very past he had tried so hard to escape. The next morning, the village stirred to life under the soft glow of dawn. Rashid had risen early, as usual, heading to the market to collect supplies for the day. The square, still adorned with remnants of the festival, was unusually quiet. He welcomed the stillness, relishing the solitude that had become his refuge. But as he approached the market, Rashid noticed something strange. A small group of villagers had gathered near the fountain, murmuring among themselves and casting wary glances toward the edge of the village. Curious but cautious, he stepped closer. "What's going on?" he asked a fisherman named Yusef, who stood near the edge of the crowd. Yusef's brow furrowed. "A stranger arrived this morning, well-dressed, not like us. Said he's looking for someone." Rashid's chest tightened. Strangers were rare in the village, and someone well-dressed was even rarer. A faint ripple of unease spread through him, but he kept his expression neutral. "Where is he now?" Rashid asked, his voice steady. Yusef pointed toward the inn at the far end of the square. "There. He's been asking questions, but no one's given him much." Rashid nodded, his mind racing. He forced himself to walk casually toward the inn, his heart pounding with every step. When he entered, the air was heavy with the smell of bread and spices. Behind the counter, the innkeeper exchanged nervous glances with a man who stood by the window. The man turned at the sound of the door, and Rashid's stomach dropped. It was Hassan. Hassan had been a trusted advisor to Rashid's family for years, a steady presence in the storm of royal politics. He was a man of sharp wit and unwavering loyalty, but his presence here could mean only one thing. The past Rashid had fled was catching up to him. "Your Highness," Hassan said, his voice low but charged with emotion. His formal greeting sounded jarring in the humble surroundings of the village inn. "I found you." Rashid stiffened. "Don't call me that," he said, his voice sharp. Hassan took a step closer, his eyes scanning Rashid's face as if searching for answers. "What are you doing here? Do you have any idea what's happening back home?" "That's not my concern anymore," Rashid replied, his tone firm. He turned toward the door, but Hassan's next words stopped him in his tracks. "The kingdom is falling apart without you." Reluctantly, Rashid sat across from Hassan at a small wooden table in the corner of the inn. The innkeeper wisely kept his distance, leaving them to their conversation. "The council is in chaos," Hassan began, his voice urgent but measured. "Without you, there's no one to hold them accountable. Factions are forming, each vying for power. If you don't return soon, there will be bloodshed." Rashid leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "I abdicated. The council should be more than capable of ruling without me." "You didn't just abdicate, Rashid. You disappeared," Hassan said, his frustration evident. "The people need a leader." "They need you." "The people," Rashid repeated bitterly. "Where were the people when Noor died? Where was the council when I needed them? They didn't care about me then. Why should I care about them now?" Hassan's expression softened, and for a moment, the tension between them ebbed. "I know you've suffered. I know you've lost more than anyone should bear. But running from your pain won't heal it, and abandoning your people won't bring Noor back." Rashid clenched his fists, the weight of Hassan's words pressing down on him. "I've built a life here," he said quietly. "I don't want to go back." Hassan studied him, his eyes filled with both understanding and determination. "You may not want to go back, but you don't have a choice. The council has sent others to find you. If they learn where you are, they won't hesitate to use force." The warning hung heavy in the air as Rashid left the inn. His mind raced with possibilities, each more troubling than the last. The life he had built in the village, the fragile peace he had found, now felt precarious, threatened by the shadow of his past. As he walked through the square, Layla appeared, her brow furrowed with concern. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "In a way, I have," Rashid said, forcing a weak smile. He didn't want to involve her, didn't want to burden her with the truth, but the weight of it was too much to carry alone. "Come with me," she said, taking his hand and leading him toward the schoolyard. The children were gone for the day, leaving the space quiet and private. They sat beneath the fig tree, its leaves rustling softly in the breeze. "Talk to me," Layla said gently. "Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone." Rashid hesitated, the words tangled in his throat. He had spent so long burying his past, hiding it even from himself. But Layla's patience, her unwavering kindness, wore down his defenses. "There's someone from my past in the village," he admitted. "Someone who wants me to go back to a life I left behind." "Why did you leave it?" she asked, her voice steady. Rashid met her gaze, the pain in his eyes unmistakable. "Because it took everything from me. My freedom, my happiness, the woman I loved." Layla's expression softened, and she reached out to place a hand on his. "And now? Now they're asking me to return. But I can't," Rashid said, his voice breaking. "I can't go back to that life. Not after everything." Layla squeezed his hand, her touch grounding him. "You have to decide what's worth fighting for, Rashid. Whether it's your past or the life you've built here. But whatever you choose, know that you don't have to face it alone." As Rashid returned to his house that evening, Hassan's warning echoed in his mind. The life he had built here, simple, peaceful, and anchored by Layla, was now at risk. The village had become his sanctuary, but the shadows of his past were closing in, threatening to consume everything he had come to care about. That night, Rashid sat by the window, staring out at the moonlit village. For the first time in months, he felt truly torn, caught between two worlds. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, and he knew that no matter what he chose, the consequences would be far-reaching. The peace of the village began to unravel in the days that followed. Whispers of Rashid's true identity spread, and tensions rose as the past he had fought to escape threatened to collide with the present he desperately wanted to protect. The air in the village was thick with unease, though most of the villagers didn't understand why. Rashid could feel her eyes on him as he moved through the square, whispers trailing in his wake. Word of the stranger Hassan had spread, and with it, rumors about why he had come. People speculated that Rashid might be in trouble, or worse, that he had brought trouble to the village. Layla, too, had noticed the shift. She approached Rashid as he unloaded supplies at the school, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "People are talking," she said quietly. "They're saying the man who came to see you isn't just a friend." Rashid set down the sack of grain he was carrying, his jaw tightening. "Let them talk. It's not that simple," Layla replied, stepping closer. "You've built a life here, Rashid. These people trust you. If you don't tell them the truth, their trust will turn to fear." Rashid sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew she was right, but the thought of revealing his past felt like ripping open an old wound. Still, he couldn't ignore the growing tension in the village or the look in Layla's eyes. "Meet me tonight," he said finally, "at the fig tree. I'll tell you everything." As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Rashid sat beneath the fig tree, waiting for Layla. The air was cool, and the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore provided a rhythmic backdrop to his restless thoughts. Layla arrived shortly after, her footsteps soft on the grass. She sat beside him, her presence grounding him in a way he couldn't explain. "I'm listening," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Rashid hesitated, the weight of his secrets pressing down on him, but he had promised to tell her the truth, and he couldn't back out now. "My name isn't Khalid," he began, his voice low. "It's Rashid Al-Mansur. He paused, swallowing hard. "I was the crown prince of a kingdom far from here." Layla's eyes widened, but she didn't interrupt, letting him continue. "I had everything once: wealth, power, responsibility. But none of it mattered because I had her." His voice faltered as he thought of Noor, her laughter, and the way her presence had lit up even the darkest corners of his life. "Her name was Noor. We were engaged. She was my world." Layla placed a hand on his arm, her touch steadying him. "There was an accident," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A fire. Noor didn't make it, and I couldn't stay. The palace, the people, the title, it all felt meaningless without her." He took a deep breath, his hands trembling. "So I left. I abdicated, disappeared. I came here to escape, to forget. But now," he shook his head, his expression darkening. "Hassan says the kingdom is in chaos, that they need me to return. And if I don't, they'll bring that chaos here." Layla was silent for a long moment, her gaze steady on his. Finally, she spoke. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I was afraid," Rashid admitted. "Afraid that if I let anyone in, I'd lose everything again." Layla's expression softened, and she reached for his hand. "You're not the man you were back then, Rashid. You've built something real here, but you can't keep running from your past. It's a part of you, whether you want it to be or not." The days that followed were tense. News of Rashid's identity began to trickle through the village, no doubt fueled by whispers from Hassan. The villagers, who had once welcomed Rashid into their community, now looked at him with suspicion. The stranger they had known as Khalid was now revealed to be a prince in hiding, and the weight of that revelation was more than some could bear. Layla stood by his side, her quiet strength a constant source of comfort. She defended him when others questioned his presence in the village, reminding them of the good he had done and the life he had built. But even her unwavering support couldn't quell the growing unrest. One evening, as Rashid returned to his house, he found Hassan waiting for him. The older man's expression was grave, his usual composure tinged with urgency. "They're coming," Hassan said without preamble. "Who's coming?" Rashid asked, though he already knew the answer. "The council's men," Hassan replied. "They've traced you here. If you don't return willingly, they'll use force." Rashid's stomach sank. He had feared this moment, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. The fragile peace of the village was about to shatter, and it was his fault. That night, Rashid sat alone by the shore, the waves crashing at his feet. He thought of everything he had found in the village: peace, purpose, and perhaps most importantly, Layla. But he also thought of the kingdom he had left behind, the people who might suffer in his absence. Layla found him there, her footsteps quiet on the sand. She sat beside him, her gaze on the horizon. "You have to make a choice," she said softly. "Stay and risk everything, or go back and face what you left behind." Rashid turned to her, his eyes filled with turmoil. "If I go back, I lose this. I lose you." Layla met his gaze, her own eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You don't lose me, Rashid. Not if you fight for us. But if you stay and the village suffers because of it. Can you live with that?" Her words cut through him like a blade, and he knew she was right. No matter how much he wanted to stay, he couldn't let the people he cared about pay the price for his past. Rashid's decision set the village on edge. As preparations were made for his departure, tensions flared, and the bonds he had formed began to fray. The journey back to the kingdom loomed ahead, fraught with uncertainty and danger. The village buzzed with an uneasy energy in the days leading up to Rashid's departure. The revelation of his identity had shifted the dynamic entirely. Where once there had been warm smiles and easy camaraderie, now there was suspicion and fear. Rashid felt the weight of every glance, every whispered conversation as he walked through the square. The life he had built was unraveling before his eyes. Layla stayed close, her presence a constant reminder of why this place mattered to him. She tried to soothe the villagers, speaking on his behalf, but even her influence had its limits. Many saw Rashid's hidden past as a betrayal, an intrusion of a world they wanted no part of. One afternoon, as Rashid prepared his modest belongings for the journey, a knock sounded at his door. He opened it to find Yusuf, the fisherman who had first told him about Hassan's arrival. The man's expression was guarded, his weathered hands clenched into fists. "You're really leaving?" Yusuf asked, his voice low. "Yes," Rashid replied. "It's the only way to keep the village safe." Yusuf studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I don't trust you, Khalid, or whatever your name is, but I've seen the work you've done here. If what they say about you is true, then I hope you do some good when you go back." The words, though tinged with skepticism, carried a glimmer of hope. Rashid nodded, feeling an odd sense of gratitude. "Thank you, Yusuf, for everything." The tension reached a breaking point that evening when a group of villagers gathered outside Rashid's house. Their voices were raised, a mixture of fear and frustration rippling through the crowd. Layla arrived just in time to intervene, placing herself between Rashid and the angry villagers. "This isn't the way," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the noise. "He's leaving to protect us, to protect you. Don't punish him for doing the right thing." A young man at the front of the crowd stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "He lied to us, Layla. He brought this trouble here. How do we know he's not just using us?" Layla's gaze hardened. "Has he ever given you a reason to doubt him? Rashid has worked alongside all of you, helped build this village into what it is. If you can't trust him, trust what he's done." The crowd murmured, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Finally, the young man stepped back, and the tension began to dissipate. One by one, the villagers dispersed, leaving Rashid and Layla alone. Inside, Rashid sat at the small wooden table, his head in his hands. Layla stood nearby, watching him with a mixture of concern and frustration. "Why didn't you defend yourself?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "What could I have said?" Rashid replied, looking up at her. "They're right. I lied to them. I brought this danger here." "You also brought hope," Layla countered, stepping closer. "They just don't see it yet. But they will." Rashid shook his head, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. "I'm not sure I deserve it." Layla knelt beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "Deserve it or not, it's the truth. And when you leave, you'll be doing it not because you're running, but because you're protecting something worth saving. That's the man they'll remember." The morning of his departure arrived with an air of finality. Hassan waited by the edge of the village, his horse saddled and ready. Rashid stood outside his house, his belongings packed into a small bundle. The villagers watched from a distance, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and unease. Layla approached him, her steps deliberate. She held out a small leather pouch, its contents jingling softly. "What's this?" Rashid asked, taking the pouch. "Provisions for the journey," she said simply. "A gift from the villagers." "Not everyone is against you, Rashid. Remember that." He looked at her, his chest tightening. "I don't know how to thank you for everything." "You don't have to," Layla replied, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "Just promise me you'll come back. Not for them, for me." Rashid swallowed hard, nodding. "I promise." Their gazes held for a long moment before Hassan cleared his throat, reminding them of the urgency of their departure. Rashid turned away reluctantly, climbing onto the horse, waiting for him. As they rode away from the village, Rashid glanced back one last time. Layla stood at the edge of the square, her figure framed by the rising sun. The sight of her strong, unwavering, was burned into his memory. It gave him strength as he faced the uncertainty ahead. The journey back to the kingdom was long and fraught with danger. Hassan warned of patrols loyal to the more radical factions of the council, men who would sooner see Rashid dead than return to power. They traveled under the cover of night, avoiding main roads and relying on Hassan's network of allies to provide shelter. Rashid found himself torn between the man he had been and the man he had become. The weight of his title, his responsibilities, felt foreign after so much time. Yet the thought of Layla and the village reminded him of why he had chosen this path. "You've changed," Hassan observed one evening as they camped by a quiet stream. "The Rashid I knew would never have walked away from the throne." "Maybe the throne isn't what matters," Rashid replied, staring into the fire. "Maybe it never was." Hassan studied him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Then what does matter?" Rashid didn't answer immediately. Instead, he thought of Layla, her laughter, and the life he had found in the village. The people. The ones who trust us to protect them. The ones who believe in us even when we don't believe in ourselves. Hassan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Then perhaps you're finally ready for what lies ahead." As Rashid approached the borders of the kingdom, the weight of his decision settled heavily on his shoulders. The path ahead was uncertain, but the choice had been made. The only question now was whether he could face the ghosts of his past and forge a new future. The landscape began to shift as Rashid and Hassan approached the borders of the kingdom. The rolling hills and dense forests gave way to the familiar arid plains of his homeland, their ochre tones stretching endlessly beneath the sun. Every mile closer to the capital deepened the ache in Rashid's chest, a mix of dread and reluctant anticipation. It had been over a year since he had last set foot in these lands, yet they felt hauntingly unchanged. Hassan rode a few paces ahead, his posture tense. Though he hadn't said much during their journey, Rashid could sense his apprehension. The kingdom they were riding into was not the one Rashid had left behind. The council's factions had splintered, each vying for dominance, and whispers of rebellion were growing louder. "We'll reach the outskirts of the capital by nightfall," Hassan said, breaking the silence. "I've arranged a meeting with those still loyal to you. They'll guide us through the city." "And the council?" Rashid asked, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. "They know you're coming," Hassan replied grimly. "Some will welcome you, others not so much." Rashid nodded, his jaw tightening. The weight of the task ahead settled heavily on his shoulders. He had chosen to return, but the path forward was fraught with uncertainty and danger. By the time they reached the edge of the capital, night had fallen. The city loomed ahead, its towering walls silhouetted against the starry sky. Rashid remembered the grandeur of the palace, its spires gleaming like beacons. But now, even from a distance, the city felt darker, its vibrancy dulled by the turmoil that had taken root in his absence. Hassan led him to a small, unassuming house on the outskirts of the city. Inside, a group of men and women waited, their faces etched with weariness and determination. Rashid recognized a few of them, former advisors, loyal guards, but many were unfamiliar. One of the men, a grizzled veteran named Tariq, stepped forward. "Your Highness," he said, bowing slightly. "It's good to see you again." Rashid raised a hand, signaling for him to rise. There's no need for formalities. I'm here to help, not to reclaim a title. Tariq exchanged a glance with the others, his expression skeptical. The council won't see it that way. They'll see your return as a threat. Good, Rashid replied, his voice firm. Let them see it that way. They've had their chance to lead, and they've failed. It's time to fix what's broken. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the group. Finally, a woman named Safiya, a former advisor to Rashid's father, stepped forward. If you mean to confront the council, you'll need all eyes, she said. The people are restless. They've lost faith in the council, but they haven't forgotten you. If you can show them that you're willing to fight for them, they'll stand with you. Rashid nodded, her words igniting a spark of resolve within him. Then that's what I'll do. The plan was set in motion the next morning. While Hassan and the others worked to rally support among the people, Rashid prepared for his first public appearance since his return. The idea of standing before the crowds again filled him with both dread and determination. He had once thrived in the public eye, but now, the weight of their expectations felt almost suffocating. Leaning against the window of the safe house, Rashid let his thoughts drift back to the village. He pictured the narrow streets, the sound of children laughing, and the warmth of Layla's presence. She had been his anchor in the storm of his grief, her strength giving him the courage to face his past. He carried her words with him now, a reminder of why he had chosen to return. Thinking of her? Hassan's voice interrupted his thoughts. Rashid turned to see his old advisor standing in the doorway, a knowing look on his face. Always, Rashid admitted. She's part of the reason you're here, isn't she? Hassan asked, stepping into the room. She is, Rashid said. But it's more than that. I owe it to the people, to Noor, to myself. Hassan nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Then let's make sure this counts. The marketplace was bustling when Rashid arrived, the air filled with the sound of vendors calling out their wares and the chatter of townsfolk. Hassan had arranged for him to speak at the main square, where a small platform had been hastily constructed. As Rashid climbed onto the stage, the crowd fell silent, their eyes widening with recognition. He scanned their faces, his heart pounding. These were the people he had once sworn to protect, the people he had abandoned in his grief. Now, they looked to him with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Rashid took a deep breath, his voice steady as he began to speak. I know many of you feel betrayed by my absence. I know I've let you down, but I'm here now not as a prince, but as a man who wants to see his people thrive. The crowd murmured, their expressions softening. For too long, the council has ruled with greed and corruption, Rashid continued. They've forgotten what it means to serve, but I haven't. I've seen what life can be when people come together, when they fight for something greater than themselves. That's what I want for all of us. The murmurs grew louder, a ripple of approval spreading through the crowd. Rashid felt a spark of hope, the first real connection he'd felt with these people in years. Help me rebuild what's been broken, he said, his voice rising. Not for the crowd, not for power, but for each other. Together, we can create a kingdom worth fighting for. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the square. Rashid felt a surge of emotion, the weight of their trust settling on his shoulders. For the first time, he believed that he could do this not for the throne, but for the people. As Rashid stepped down from the platform, Hassan met him with a rare smile. You've given them hope, he said. That's more than the council ever could. Rashid nodded, his resolve strengthening, but he knew the hardest part was yet to come. The council would not relinquish their power easily, and the battle ahead would test everything he had. With the people rallying behind him, Rashid prepared to confront the council. The battle for the kingdom's future was about to begin, and the stakes had never been higher. The morning sun cast long shadows across the city as Rashid approached the council chambers. The once proud capital had grown weary, its streets marked by signs of neglect and unrest. Yet, amidst the crumbling facades, there was an undeniable energy, a renewed hope kindled by Rashid's return. His speech in the marketplace had sparked something in the people, and they now looked to him to lead them through the storm. Hassan walked beside him, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Behind them, a small group of loyalists, including Tariq and Safiya, moved silently, their expressions tense. The plan was simple: confront the council, expose their corruption, and rally the remaining undecided members to Rashid's cause. But simplicity rarely translated into ease. "You're certain about this?" Hassan asked, his voice low. "I have to be," Rashid replied. "The people deserve better." "Noor deserve better." Hassan nodded, his expression hardening. "Then let's finish this." The council chambers were a stark contrast to the rest of the city. While the streets outside bore the scars of neglect, the chamber gleamed with opulence, golden chandeliers, polished marble floors, and tapestries depicting the kingdom's storied past. It was a glaring reminder of the disparity between the rulers and the ruled. As Rashid entered, the room fell silent. The council members, seated in a semicircle, turned their gazes toward him. Some looked surprised, others wary. A few, like Sheikh Karim, the de facto leader of the council, regarded him with thinly veiled hostility. "Your Highness," Karim said, his tone dripping with insincerity, "to what do we owe the honor of your presence?" Rashid stepped forward, his posture straight and his voice steady. "I've come to reclaim what was lost, not the throne, but the trust of the people, and to hold those who betrayed that trust accountable." A murmur rippled through the chamber, the tension thickening. "You abdicated," Karim said, his tone sharp. "You left this kingdom in our hands, and we've done what was necessary to maintain order." "Order?" Rashid repeated, his voice rising. "Look outside these walls, Karim. Does that look like order to you? The people are starving while you sit here, surrounded by gold and power. That's not leadership, it's tyranny." Karim's face darkened, but before he could respond, Safiya stepped forward. "Enough of this posturing, Karim. We all know what's happening. You've used the prince's absence to line your own pockets, to consolidate your power. It's time for the truth to come to light." The chamber erupted into chaos as accusations flew back and forth. Rashid remained steadfast, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the council members. He could see the cracks in their facade. Some looked guilty, others conflicted. These were the ones he needed to reach. "If any of you still believe in what this kingdom stands for," Rashid said, his voice cutting through the noise, "then stand with me, help me rebuild it. Together, we can create a future where the people aren't just subjects, they're partners in their own destiny." A heavy silence fell over the chamber. Rashid's words hung in the air, a challenge and a promise. Slowly, one of the younger council members, a man named Farid, stood. "He's right," Farid said, his voice trembling but resolute. "We've lost our way. If we continue down this path, there won't be a kingdom left to rule." One by one, others began to rise, their faces filled with determination. Karim's expression shifted from anger to desperation as his grip on power began to slip. But Karim was not a man to relinquish control easily. As the tide turned against him, his voice rang out, cold and commanding. "You think this is over? That you can waltz in here and take back what you abandoned? The people may cheer for you now, but loyalty is fleeting." He gestured toward the guards stationed at the edges of the chamber. "Arrest him." The guards hesitated, their hands hovering over their weapons. Rashid stepped forward, his voice ringing with authority. "I am still your prince. If you lay a hand on me, it will not be justice, it will be treason." The guards froze, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. The council chamber had become a battleground, not of weapons, but of wills. Suddenly, the doors burst open, and a group of townspeople flooded in. They were led by Tariq, who had been working behind the scenes to rally support. Their presence was a turning point, a reminder that the people's voice carried more weight than any council decree. "You rule at our will," one of the townspeople shouted, pointing at Karim, "and we will no longer be silent." Karim's face twisted with rage, but he was cornered. The momentum had shifted irreversibly, and even he couldn't deny it. In the aftermath, the council was dissolved, its members stripped of their unchecked power. Rashid refused to claim the throne, instead proposing a new governing body where the people would have representation. His vision was radical, but it resonated with the townspeople and many former council members. Karim was removed from the chambers under guard. His reign of manipulation and greed finally ended. As he was led away, he turned to Rashid, his eyes filled with venom. "This isn't over." Rashid met his gaze, unflinching. "It is for you." That evening, Rashid stood on the palace balcony, overlooking the city. The streets below were alive with celebration, the people reveling in the hope of a brighter future. Hassan joined him, his expression both relieved and proud. "You did it," Hassan said. "You gave them something to believe in." "It's not just me," Rashid replied. "It's all of us." He thought of Lila, her words echoing in his mind. "You have to decide what's worth fighting for." He had made his choice, but his journey wasn't over. The kingdom's future would require constant vigilance and effort, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. With the council dismantled, Rashid faced a new challenge, navigating the delicate process of rebuilding trust and laying the foundations for a fairer, more just kingdom. But amidst the hope, a revelation threatened to upend everything he had fought for. The days following the dissolution of the council were a blur of activity. Rashid worked tirelessly alongside his loyalists and the people to begin rebuilding the kingdom's fractured governance. The new council, composed of representatives from across the land, was still taking shape. But the energy in the capital had shifted. There was hope in the air, fragile, yet unmistakable. Despite the progress, Rashid's mind remained restless. The echoes of Karim's parting words lingered. This isn't over. The former council leader had been sent to the palace's dungeons, but Rashid couldn't shake the feeling that there were more secrets waiting to surface. Hassan had been tasked with overseeing Karim's interrogation. Late one evening, as Rashid reviewed proposals for the new council, Hassan entered the chamber, his expression grim. "We need to talk," Hassan said, closing the door behind him. "What is it?" Rashid asked, setting aside the papers. "It's about Karim," Hassan said, lowering his voice. "He's been talking." Rashid straightened, his pulse quickening. "What did he say?" Hassan hesitated before responding, his tone heavy. "The fire. Noor's death. It wasn't an accident." The words hit Rashid like a blow. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He had spent the past year burying the pain of that day, convincing himself that it had been a cruel twist of fate. But now, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. "Explain," Rashid demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. Hassan leaned forward, his expression grave. Karim admitted to orchestrating it. He and a faction of the council saw Noor as a threat, someone who would influence you to challenge their control. The fire was their way of ensuring you remained compliant. Rashid's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. "And when I left, they didn't expect it," Hassan said. "Karim said your abdication caught them off guard. They thought you'd stay and become a puppet they could manipulate." The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them. Rashid's mind raced with memories of that fateful day. The smoke, the chaos, and Noor's voice calling out to him before it was silenced forever. The next morning, Rashid visited the dungeons. The stone corridors were cold and damp, the air heavy with the scent of mildew. Karim sat in a small cell, his once pristine robes now tattered and stained. Despite his circumstances, his eyes still gleamed with defiance. "You've come to gloat?" Karim sneered as Rashid approached. "No," Rashid said, his voice cold. "I've come for the truth." Karim leaned back against the wall, a cruel smile tugging at his lips. "And what will you do with it? Justice? Revenge?" "The truth isn't for you," Rashid replied, his gaze steady. "It's for Noor, for the people you betrayed." Karim chuckled, the sound echoing through the chamber. "You think the truth will bring you peace? It won't. You'll still be haunted by her death. And no matter what you build here, the shadows of your past will follow you." Rashid's jaw tightened, but he refused to give Karim the satisfaction of seeing him falter. "Your time is over, Karim. The kingdom will heal. and you'll rot in this cell, forgotten." Rashid left the dungeons, his heart heavy but his resolve unshaken. He couldn't change the past, but he could honor Noor's memory by ensuring that the kingdom she had loved was rebuilt on a foundation of justice and compassion. That evening, he stood on the palace balcony, gazing out at the city. The stars above reminded him of the nights he had spent with Noor, dreaming of a future that would never come. But as he thought of the village, of Layla, a new sense of purpose began to take root. Layla's words echoed in his mind. "You have to decide what's worth fighting for." He had made his choice to fight for the people, for a better future, but now he understood that part of that fight was facing the truth, no matter how painful. In the days that followed, Rashid made the decision to publicly disclose the council's corruption, including their role in Noor's death. It was a risk one that could reignite tensions, but he believed that transparency was the only way to rebuild trust. The announcement was met with shock and outrage, but also a renewed determination among the people. They rallied behind Rashid, their voices rising in unity against the remnants of the old regime. Layla's words often guided him during this time. Though miles separated them, her influence was ever present. She had taught him that strength wasn't just about power, it was about resilience, compassion, and the courage to face the truth. One evening, as Rashid reviewed the plans for the kingdom's new governance, a messenger arrived. He carried a small package wrapped in simple cloth, along with a letter. Rashid recognized the handwriting immediately. The letter was from Layla. Her words were a mixture of encouragement and longing, her belief in him unwavering. The package contained a simple token, a small carving of a fig tree, its branches spread wide. It was a reminder of the village, of the life he had left behind but carried with him always. As Rashid held the carving, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt that he was walking the right path. With the truth revealed and the kingdom beginning to heal, Rashid faced his greatest challenge yet, deciding the role he would play in its future. The choices he made would shape not only his destiny, but the destiny of the people he had sworn to protect. The capital buzzed with a sense of renewal as the dust of revolution began to settle. The dismantling of the old council had cleared the way for Rashid's vision of a more inclusive governance, and the people were cautiously optimistic. Yet, amid the hope, Rashid faced a question he could no longer ignore. What role would he play in this new kingdom? For weeks, he'd been the de facto leader, rallying the people and spearheading reforms. But the weight of the crown, figurative and literal, still felt like a shackle. Each step forward brought him closer to a crossroads, one that demanded a choice between the life he had built in the village and the responsibility he felt to the kingdom. One morning, Rashid gathered his closest allies, Hassan, Safiya, Tariq, and the newly appointed representatives of the Provisional Council in the palace's Great Hall. The room, once a symbol of opulence and excess, now reflected a more modest and practical tone, its lavish decorations replaced with simple banners bearing the emblem of unity. "Thank you for coming," Rashid began, his voice steady but somber. "We've come a long way in a short time, but our work is far from finished. The foundations of a new government are in place, but they need time to grow strong." Tariq nodded, his grizzled features set in determination. "And they will. With your leadership, the people have hope again." Rashid met his gaze, his heart heavy with the decision he had made. "That's why I've asked you all here, to tell you that I will not remain as your leader." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Hassan was the first to speak, his voice low but firm. "Rashid, you've been the catalyst for everything we've achieved. The people trust you. They need you. They need stability," Rashid replied, "and a leader who can guide them without the baggage of the past. I've done what I came here to do, set the kingdom on a new path, but I'm not the one to walk it with them." Safiya leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing. "And what will you do? Return to the village? To obscurity?" Rashid smiled faintly, the image of Layla and the fig tree flashing in his mind. "I'll return to where I belong, to the life I've built and the people who gave me the strength to come back." That's where I can truly make a difference." As the meeting adjourned, Rashid retreated to the palace gardens, seeking a moment of solitude. The air was cool, the scent of jasmine mingling with the faint rustle of leaves. Hassan found him there, his expression conflicted. "You're sure about this?" Hassan asked, standing beside him. "I am," Rashid replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "The kingdom doesn't need a prince. It needs a leader chosen by the people, someone who can unite them without the shadow of the past hanging over their heads." Hassan nodded slowly. "You've always had the heart of a leader, Rashid, but I understand. You've earned the right to choose your own path. And you?" Rashid asked, turning to him. "Will you stay?" Hassan's lips twitched into a rare smile. "Someone needs to make sure these fools don't ruin what we've built." They shared a quiet laugh, the weight of the moment tempered by the bond they had forged through years of hardship. That evening, Rashid addressed the people from the palace balcony. The square below was packed with townsfolk, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of torches. Rashid's voice carried across the crowd, steady and filled with conviction. "My people," he began, "you have shown me what true strength looks like. Not the strength of swords or crowns, but the strength of unity, of hope, of resilience. This kingdom belongs to you, and it is you who will shape its future." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Rashid paused, his next words hanging heavily on his lips. "I have fulfilled my purpose here. Now, it is time for others to lead, for you to choose the voices that will guide us forward." The crowd erupted into a mixture of cheers and gasps, their reactions reflecting both admiration and surprise. Rashid raised a hand, silencing them. "This is not the end," he said. "It is a new beginning for all of us." As the crowd cheered, Rashid felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. He had made his choice, and it was the right one. The next morning, Rashid prepared to leave the capital. The palace staff and his allies gathered to bid him farewell, their expressions a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Safiya embraced him briefly, her sharp demeanor softening for a moment. "You'll be missed, Rashid," she said, "but I understand why you have to go." "Huh?" Hassan clapped him on the shoulder, his usual stoicism giving way to a rare smile. "Take care of yourself, and if you ever need a place to stay, you know where to find me." Rashid smiled, his heart full as he mounted his horse. The city walls grew smaller behind him as he rode toward the village, each mile bringing him closer to the life he had chosen. As Rashid arrived in the village, he was greeted by familiar sights and sounds. The bustling market, the laughter of children, the scent of fresh bread wafting from the bakery. It was home in a way the palace had never been. Layla was waiting for him by the schoolhouse, her expression unreadable. When their eyes met, her face softened, and she approached him with measured steps. "You're back," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I am," Rashid replied, dismounting, "for good this time." Layla studied him for a moment before a smile broke across her face. "Good. You have a lot of work to do." Rashid laughed, to sound light and unguarded. "I wouldn't have it any other way." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rashid and Layla sat beneath the fig tree. The air was warm, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. Rashid leaned back against the tree trunk, a sense of contentment settling over him. "I've missed this," he said, his voice soft. Layla glanced at him, her eyes filled with quiet affection. "So have I." For the first time in years, Rashid felt whole. The journey had been long and fraught with pain, but it had led him here to the life and the love he had always needed. With his journey complete, Rashid embraced the simple yet fulfilling life he had chosen. But as the village thrived, a new challenge emerged, hinting at the promise of yet another chapter in his story. The village settled into a rhythm of quiet prosperity in the weeks following Rashid's return. The marketplace buzzed with life, the school thrived under Layla's care, and the new fishing docks Rashid had helped build brimmed with activity. Rashid himself had become an integral part of the community once more, his presence woven into the fabric of daily life. But while the village carried on in peaceful simplicity, Rashid couldn't ignore the subtle changes within himself. He had returned as a man who had faced his past, and with that came a deeper appreciation for the present. The ache of his losses no longer consumed him. Instead, they lived within him as reminders of the strength he had gained and the lessons he had learned. One morning, Rashid stood in the schoolyard, hammer in hand as he repaired the fence. The sound of children's laughter filled the air, and the scent of wildflowers drifted on the breeze. Layla approached, her arms crossed and a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You're becoming quite the handyman," she teased. Rashid straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "I've had good practice." Layla leaned against the fence, her expression softening. "The children adore you, you know. They talk about you as if you're some kind of hero." "They'll outgrow that soon enough," Rashid replied with a chuckle. "But I'm glad they feel safe." Layla's smile deepened. "You've given them more than safety, Rashid. You've given them hope. And not just them, the whole village." Rashid met her gaze, the sincerity in her words warming him in a way he hadn't expected. "I didn't do it alone. You've been the heart of this place, Layla." Her cheeks flushed slightly, but her eyes didn't waver. "Maybe. But you reminded us all what it means to fight for something worth holding on to." That evening, the village gathered for a small celebration to mark the completion of the new docks. Lanterns hung between trees, their warm glow casting a soft light over the square. Musicians played lively tunes, and the scent of roasted meats and fresh bread filled the air. Rashid stood near the edge of the crowd, watching as the villagers danced and laughed. It was a far cry from the chaos and opulence of the palace, yet it felt infinitely more meaningful. Layla joined him, her dress catching the lantern light as she smiled up at him. "You're not going to just stand here all night, are you?" "I might," Rashid replied, his tone teasing. Layla laughed, reaching for his hand. "Not tonight, you're not. Come on." Before he could protest, she pulled him into the square, weaving through the crowd until they reached the center. The music swelled, and Rashid found himself swept up in the moment. Layla's laughter rang out as they danced, her joy infectious. For the first time in years, Rashid allowed himself to be fully present. The weight of his past felt distant, replaced by the warmth of connection and belonging. As the celebration wound down, Rashid and Layla walked together through the quiet streets of the village. The stars above were brilliant, their light reflected in the calm waters of the nearby sea. They reached the fig tree, its broad branches casting a familiar shadow over the ground. "This tree has seen it all," Layla said, her voice soft. Rashid nodded, his gaze on the tree's gnarled trunk. "It's a survivor. Like you," Layla said, turning to face him. "You've been through so much, Rashid, but you're still here, still standing." Her words carried a weight that settled deep within him. "Because of people like you," he admitted. "You reminded me of what matters, of what I want to fight for." Layla smiled, stepping closer. "And what's that?" "You," Rashid said simply. "This village, this life." Layla's eyes glimmered with emotion, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then she leaned in, and their foreheads touched, the connection between them solidifying in the stillness. The weeks turned into months, and Rashid's life in the village grew richer with each passing day. The school expanded, the market thrived, and the village became a beacon of hope for surrounding communities. Travelers began arriving, drawn by the stories of a place where people lived in harmony and helped one another. Rashid and Layla became partners in every sense, their bond deepening as they worked side by side. Their love wasn't grand or dramatic. It was steady and enduring, built on a foundation of trust and shared purpose. One evening, as they sat by the fig tree, Rashid looked out at the village, his heart full. "Do you ever think about what's next?" he asked. Layla tilted her head, her gaze thoughtful. "Next? For us or for the village?" "For both," Rashid said. Layla smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I think we'll keep building, keep fighting for what matters. Together." Rashid placed a hand over hers, the future stretching out before them like the stars above. Together. But peace, though cherished, is rarely permanent. One day, A rider arrived at the edge of the village, his horse weary from the journey. Rashid greeted him, his brow furrowing as he noticed the urgency in the man's expression. "Your Highness," the rider said, bowing slightly. "I'm not a prince anymore," Rashid replied, though his voice carried a note of curiosity. "What brings you here?" The rider straightened, his gaze steady. "There's trouble brewing in the northern provinces. They need someone who understands the people, someone they trust. They need you." Rashid exchanged a glance with Layla, who had joined him. Her eyes were calm, yet he could see the flicker of concern behind them. "We'll talk," Rashid said, dismissing the rider for the moment. As they stood together beneath the fig tree, Rashid felt the weight of his past and present converging once more. That this time, he wasn't alone. He had a home, a purpose, and a partner by his side. Whatever lay ahead, he knew they would face it together. The fig tree stood tall, its roots deep in the soil, its branches wide and welcoming. Beneath it, Rashid and Layla watched the sun set over the village, their hands intertwined. The road ahead would not be easy, but they had found their place, their purpose, and each other. And that, Rashid thought, was worth fighting for.